Hello YouTube do-it-yourselfers. This video features a 1984 Evinrude 15 horsepower fuel pump rebuild. Let's get to it. First thing you're going to want to do is take the cowling off the motor, pull down on this lever, and pull up on this handle. Give it a little wiggle, pops right off. Easy peasy. With the motor cowling off, on the starboard side of the motor, this square block unit here is your fuel pump. Before you take any of this apart, take note of how the fuel lines are connected to the fuel pump and which orientation. There's two of them. There's a larger line and there's a smaller line on the bottom side. The larger line goes out to your fuel tank. The smaller line goes back to your carburetor. Notice how this comes out this direction and this comes down. It's possible when you put this all back together to have these orientated incorrectly. So keep in mind which orientation you have it, or take a picture right off the bat. Next, I'm going to unscrew this screw that holds the filter housing on. Once that's off, I can take this filter housing and try to remove it from the fuel line. Note that the fuel clamp is already off. In this case, it was a zip tie and it's gone now. Set this aside for later use. Next, I'm going to remove some screws from this fuel pump to pull the fuel pump off of the motor assembly. Now, these 4 screws don't all do the exact same thing. This screw and this screw are what holds the fuel pump on to the motor. Do not loosen these 2 screws yet. At this point, the fuel pump is loose from the motor. I'm just going to pry on it a little bit gently to break it away from the motor. That's all it took. Now at this point also, I can remove this bottom fuel line. Again, it was a zip tie and it's gone now. So I'm just going to remove it, but if there were a hose clamp on here, I would remove that at this point. Now your fuel pump assembly is removed for your motor. You can work on it on your bench. At this point, it's important to note that there is a center hole where the fuel pump was just removed. This hole and this hole are for mounting purposes. This hole here is what works your fuel pump. Essentially, the internal workings of the motor create a positive pressure during the stroke, and it works the fuel pump kind of like a balloon, but extremely fast. You'll want to make sure that this hole stays clear of any debris and make sure that there's nothing inside of it. Also, this entire mating surface here needs to be free of any gasket material. Next, we're getting ready to tear this fuel pump apart. Notice how these 2 screws only fasten to the mounting surface on the back side of the pump only. That's why we only took these 2 screws out when we removed it from the motor. If you try to take all 4 screws out when you're removing it from the motor, you're going to inadvertently disassemble the entire pump while it's still kind of connected to the motor. Basically, you're going to end up with a ton of parts just flopping around in your motor. The reason you don't want to do that is because you'll want to pay attention to how this is taken apart. This is essentially just sandwiched in several layers throughout. There's springs and such inside of this that are connected to valves, so you'll want to keep those 2 screws attached until you pull it off the motor. When you're looking at this, the reason I'm rebuilding this, you see here all of this cracking from all of this rubber. That's not good. This line here goes almost all the way into the diaphragm part here. These things, they just wear out. Just plan on replacing them from time to time. Examine them, look at them occasionally. This particular part here, you can see really well, it lives right underneath the filter housing that we took off earlier. That screw that holds the filter housing into its place here never needs to be crazy tight either. Just be really careful about that. The housing is plastic. If you get crazy about tightening it, you'll crack the housing, and then you're into it. All right, we're going to start disassembling this thing. Another note before starting disassemble. On one side of this fuel pump, there's a ridge on all the sandwich parts leading through the entire thing. That's not the case on any of these other sides. So what you'll want to do is make sure when you put this all back together that you'll want that ridge all in line. Now there is a ridge over here and over here, but it doesn't carry through like it does on this side. So just keep in mind of that. Also, when you're taking this all apart, we're going to start pulling this apart, but while we do it, we're going to look for anything in here that would suggest orientation and make a note of it. In this case, there's two sides to this plate, right? There's this side and there's the bottom side. On this side, they have a U stamped in it. I'm going to put this back together with that U facing out because that's the way the manufacturer did it. That's the way I'm going to do it. I'm going to start by taking these screws out. Flathead screwdriver. Now before I let this go, note that there are springs inside of this. If I just simply let this go and start messing around, tipping it sideways, I'm going to dump all my parts. If you have instructions, great. If you don't, again, you're going to really want to pay attention to your orientation on everything. I would take pictures with your smartphone or whatever as you go. So again, just keep your orientation correct. In this particular case, the fuel outlet is in line 90 degrees from the ridge. Next thing I'm going to do is very carefully pry up on all of this. Try to get it snapped apart. There's no more fasteners holding anything together at this point. It's simply just stuck together. So I'm going to look at this. Make sure which side is up or down so that I don't inadvertently, when I go to put it back together like that or like this or so on. I should note that you should not be taking this apart unless you have a rebuild kit available. There's a high likelihood of ripping these diaphragm pieces. The only reason I'm taking my time right now is because there's a spring and a valve in here. And I don't want those to go flying because I need to use them for orientation when I go to put it back together. Now on the tip of that spring, there's a little piece of plastic. This is important. Don't lose that if you don't have a fuel pump kit. If you have a fuel pump kit, this should be part of it. I'll remove my spring. At this point, we're just going to pop this off. Going to set that aside for now. And this is working on itself right now, but there's a spring under that diaphragm. This gasket seems to be on there pretty good, so I may have to kind of chisel it off, unless this is a part that you have in your fuel pump kit.
This is the fuel pump kit that I purchased. It's from OMC. It's a Johnson Evinrude brand fuel pump kit. I highly recommend that you buy OMC or Johnson Evinrude parts for this particular build. Off-brands on fuel systems are going to give you trouble. These are the parts that come in that kit. New gaskets and diaphragms and some of the valve body. Now in the case of this part, Some of the gasket material is stuck really badly on the back of it. You can take a knife or some kind of a scraper to get it off, but you're going to want to get it off. Don't leave old gaskets on there. You've got a new gasket in the kit. You need to use them. Keep in mind that if you use a scraper or a knife, you're not going to want to cut into that material because it's just plastic. Now that I have all the gasket material removed, I want to look at all these little channels inside of this plastic part. Blast them all out with carb cleaner or brake cleaner, but you'll want this as clean as you can possibly get it. Now this is part of the base of the fuel pump. It's got a gasket on the backside that we'll want to remove. We'll want to take extra care to remove all the gasket material and make sure that there is nothing down in this hole that feeds into this plate and through these little channels here. Use some carb cleaner or some brake cleaner and blast that all out real clean. We're going to start the assembly process. I'm going to use the 2 screws that mount the fuel pump to the motor. Notice that on this frame, some of these holes are threaded and some of them are not. I'm going to use the holes that are not threaded to put the bolts through as a platform to rest all the parts on and as a guide. Keep in mind that there's a notch here and another notch on the other side of this frame. I'm going to use these as reference points, putting this all together. First gasket that we're going to put on looks like this, and we're just going to set it on there. No orientation needed. Next, we're going to put a diaphragm on. Notice that the material is a bit of a fabric-based rubber type material. It's different than the gasket material. Notice how there's a notch on the edge of this. I'm going to correspond that with the point on the frame. When you put this on, just be so careful not to rip it. They rip so easy, and if you rip it, you're done. You gotta get a new kit. Next up is we have this little cup in our kit. It goes cup side up away from the diaphragm so as to not to cut the diaphragm. Try to place it in the center of that the best you can. Then you get the large spring from the kit and just rest it inside of that cup. Next, we're going to orientate the valve body to the frame. Notice on the top left that there's a bump with a small bump. We're going to leave that in that orientation for the rest of the assembly process. Now on the back side of the valve body, there's a circle in the center of it that corresponds with that spring. I want that spring to nest inside of that circle when I put this all back together. Next, I'm going to put this gasket in place. Notice how this pattern matches up to the valve body pattern below it. I want to make sure that it's in this orientation when I put this together. Now, depending on the orientation of your outlet line, this spring can either go in the left slot or the right slot. In this case, it's going in the right slot. Next, you want to put this little piece of plastic in the tip of the spring. Try to hold it together and set it in the right slot. When you set it in there, you just want it to kind of balance. Try to keep it as vertical as you possibly can for the next step of the assembly. Next, we're putting the next diaphragm on. I'm going to marry it up to this plastic outlet piece. Keep in mind the 2 holes that are in the diaphragm marry up to the 2 holes in the center of the frame. While I'm putting this on, I'm trying really hard not to knock that spring valve over. I want to keep it as vertical as possible. So I'm just going to glide this on as gentle as I can without tipping that over. I've got it together now. I'm going to keep pressure on it with my fingers until I get screws put together on it. Also, take note, that there's a bit of a bulge in the diaphragm in this general area here. That kind of assures me that I have my spring vertical and it's loaded up against the diaphragm. Next part to go on is this gasket here. I'm just going to rest it on these threads while holding the frame together so as the springs don't decompress and blow it all apart.
And when I go to reassemble this part here, the U is going to be facing outward. Notice that there's a channel here. It can go just about any orientation, but this little nub here has to correspond with the nub on the plastic part sandwiched just below it. If it doesn't, it's in the wrong orientation. Now there's a nub on the other side, but notice this doesn't have that nub. That nub is unique to just this one side on this particular part. So that is going to correspond with that other part there. Like so. Then we're going to go ahead and reassemble this. Pop those screws out before you give those too much of a torque. Just kind of shake it around, make sure everything's nesting nicely. You can go ahead and tighten these down. You don't have to get crazy with them. Just get them as tight as you can by hand. There you go. Again, this orientation here to this nub is important. Next, we're going to go ahead and put this gasket on. Now notice how the gasket nests around the head of these screws nicely in that orientation. It does not in this orientation. So you want those gaskets cut out to nest around those screws. And with the picture that I took before, I know that the orientation of this in relation to this goes like this. Now, I'm not going to get crazy tightening this. Probably about that's good. Notice that the screw head on here is really shallow. I believe they do that on purpose so that you don't have a tendency of over tightening, because this tends to pop out once you get to a certain point on that. But at this point, we're assembled. Quick tip on these. You'll want to test this before you put it back on your motor. You can blow through this and you'll hear kind of a screeching noise. But you cannot blow through here. If you can blow through here and you can't blow through here, you've done it right. If you can blow through here and here, you've got to take this apart and figure out where you went wrong. Generally, it's going to be the alignment of one of these pieces is what's going to give you fits. But you should only be able to blow through here and not here. All right, at this point, we can reconnect our fuel lines. I'm doing it before I mount it back onto the engine block. It's a lot easier to do it this way. Like so. And then I'm just going to kind of nurse it down into position. When you're doing this, make absolutely sure that you're not cross-threading your screws when they go in there. If it feels like for even a second that you are, you have to stop immediately. A lot of times I'll just use my fingers to get the first 3 or 4 threads started. Once you get it started, you can finish with a screwdriver. Don't over tighten one and then try to crank on the other one. You want to snug these up in tandem. You know, quarter turn, go back and forth a little bit till you can get these on here pretty snug. Again, you don't want to get crazy, so you will strip threads out, but you want it snug enough to make sure that it's not going to come apart with the vibration of the motor. And we are installed. That concludes this video. If you like what you see, give me a like, maybe a subscribe. I'd appreciate it. I'll keep trying to do more videos like this. Thanks for your time.